The pragmatists, who were very influenced by Charles Darwin, by the way, came to the conclusion at the beginning of the 20th century that truth was bounded by claims of practicality. So if you're trying to determine whether a statement is true, the implicit question that goes along with that is true in relationship to what end? So, and the question then is sort of like, is your tool that you're using to represent the world or to act on it good enough to do what you're trying to do with it? And then if it's good enough, then your claim is true enough. Now, this is tightly tied to Darwinian philosophy, and the pragmatists recognized this right away. The pragmatists were an American group of philosophers who worked on the East Coast, particularly in Boston. And they immediately took the Darwinian hypothesis to their heart, so to speak, because the Darwinian hypothesis is also pragmatic. The Darwinian hypothesis says whatever reality is and also becomes. So it's something, but it's something that's changing too. And it changes in a way that's actually not predictable. Technically it's not predictable. It's like the stock market in that way. There are periods of time over which you can make predictions, but if you wait long enough, no matter what you think, you're going to end up wrong. Especially given what knowledge is for a human being, because your knowledge is bounded, and. And so the way the Darwinian process solves that is by death, essentially. Things that aren't good enough to solve the problem that currently presents itself to them, either die or fail to reproduce. And to the degree that organisms can come up with truth claims that are sufficient, then they live long enough to reproduce, and then the next generation faces the same problem. And that's always the way it is that truth chases a reality that's fundamentally unpredictable and that's transforming constantly. Now, the reason I want to tell you that, it's an important thing to understand, because I'm going to make a claim here that the ways of looking at the world that are more mythological than material are also real ways of looking at the world. And it's not what people generally think, because you think about fiction as not real, and underneath fiction is mythology and religious claims and that sort of thing. That's the domain of fiction and mythology. And we don't think about that as real. But that's because we think about what's real from a Newtonian perspective and not from a Darwinian perspective. From a Darwinian perspective, and this is also a claim that Nietzsche made. Nietzsche said, truth serves life. But what Darwin would say is, you can't define truth in any other way than that which serves life. That's it. You're not going to get past that. There isn't a truth past that. The truth, as far as a bounded living organism is concerned, and that certainly means us, is the body of knowledge, conceptual and embodied, that best enables survival in the face of continual transformation. And that's that. There's nothing under it. Now, as soon as you know that, then what happens is that it turns out that the things that mean things to you are also real. Now, science is a funny business, right? Because what science attempted to do, and for very useful reasons, was to strip everything subjective and subjectively meaningful off the picture of the world, right? So if you're a scientist, you want to be objective. And part of the way you do that is by trying to suppress your own subjectivity in the search for the objective truth. But also you do that by relying on other people's observations. So we kind of make a deal, and the deal is, if I see it and can describe it, and you see it and can describe it, and then a bunch of other people do the same thing, and we come to the same conclusion, we're going to treat that as real. And that's useful. It's useful because it's useful to specify things precisely and to put them in the appropriate categories. And in a sense, that's what science does, is that it continually strives to differentiate things and put them in identifiable categories. And that means that increasingly we're able to use what we categorize as knowledge to help us confront the world. So, it's a great process, it's a brilliant process, and it's even more remarkable because relatively stupid people can do it, because it's algorithmized. The science is a method, and so once you know the method, you don't even have to be that smart to make progress. You can just grind away at something with the method, and sooner or later you'll produce new information, and that's a great thing. It's like science is like a factory that produces knowledge. So that's wonderful. But what's not so wonderful about it, arguably, is that it's in some sense warped our our concept of what constitutes reality. And it's never really solved, as far as I can tell, this conflict between a Newtonian perspective on what's real and a Darwinian perspective on what's real. And as far as I can tell, Darwin trumps Newton. And that's true if you're a biologist, for sure, because there isn't anything that's more true that sits underneath biology than the theory of natural selection. And that's partly a philosophical claim. And the claim is, because you can't represent all of external reality with ultimate accuracy, you're going to fail. And everything that's bounded, or even everything that's not as complex as the thing that's trying to be represented, is going to fail. So how do you deal with that? You generate variations. And it has to be somewhat random because you don't know what's coming. You generate random variations, and then hopefully one of those variations will work in relationship to whatever is coming. And so it's also a kind of truth claim that's an embodied truth claim, right? You carry the fundamental truth of your existence in the shape of your physiology. So, you know, and earlier claims of philosophical truth were mostly disembodied. You know, there was some implicit idea that the consciousness or the soul was more real than the body. And, well, it's nice to think about that in some ways because it opens the door to the idea of things like immortality, but it doesn't seem to be very... It's hard not to associate that with a dream.